and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we talk about protests continuing in Sudan as it marks the third anniversary of the 2019 massacre. 100 days are over of the war in Ukraine, and in sports, UEFA apologizes to fans. Sudan marked the third anniversary of the killing of over 100 protesters outside the army headquarters in Khartoum on June 3. The overthrow in 2019 of the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship created a strong pro-democracy movement. However, armed forces are violently suppressing it. The UN has been trying to chalk out a solution, but it has only gained partisan appeal. Protests are spread across cities and towns, but brutally being repressed. Recently, the country ended a state of emergency, but killings, injuries, and arrests continue. The torture of activists is common. We talked to Prashant from People's Dispatch about the situation after 3 years. Prashant, first of all, could you take us through the June 3 protests and what triggered them?
Right. So the protests yesterday, of course, were a commemoration of the very infamous and brutal June 3rd massacre in 2019. Now, as you mentioned, Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan for decades. He was a very brutal ruler. A pro-democracy movement rises in December 2018. The protests are massive. They cause, it's been called the Sudanese revolution. And at that point, the army, which is very much in power, realizes that Omar al-Bashir becomes a liability and basically moves him out in order to at least preserve as much of the establishment they can as possible. And after that, there's a stalemate between the army and the protesters. Protesters gather before the army headquarters in Khartoum to demand a full-fledged transition to democracy. And at that point of time, security forces, including the very, very brutal rapid support forces, still playing a huge role today, enacted this massacre, over 100 people killed in very brutal ways, people drowned, dead bodies thrown into the river, sexual assault, many of the injured victims further attacked. And that was a very landmark moment in some senses because the brutality was so intense it spurred further protests. The army later was forced to go into a compromise, but as we know, in October 2021, they staged a coup. Once again, removed all vestiges of the civilian government from Sudan. So even the civilians who had very limited power anyway, even they were removed in the October 2021 coup. And since then, the army has been ruling completely on its own. Protests have continued. There have been marches of millions on a number of occasions. The protesters, despite facing immense repression, at every march, despite facing attacks, they've continued to protest. And what we also see is that I think yesterday's march, one person died. That makes it the 99th person to be killed in these protests since October 2021. Hundreds have been injured. There have been reports of how many of these injuries have been due to the firing of live ammunition. Tear gas is used all the time against these protesters. So very, very disturbing situation in Sudan. Despite the fact that it does not necessarily make the news so much because we have a very systematic mode of repression that is being carried out by the military regime over there. And what we also see is that yesterday's protests were very highly symbolic because in some senses it was a callback to another brutal moment of repression that took place in 2019. And after that, the military was forced to withdraw. So the protesters also remembering the sacrifices made by their comrades and compatriots, remembering the spirit of resistance that animated those protests in 2019, which continues to drive them today, and calling for, remembering these martyrs and to continue the protests, continue the movement on the same line to bring more people into it. So that's broadly the significance of these June 3rd annual protests. It's been a big commemoration since 2019, especially important since the October 21st coup, and considering the situation on the struggle on the streets right now.
Okay, Prashant, the state of emergency is supposed to have ended, but the repression continues. How do you explain this phenomenon?
Right. So if you talk to, our colleague Pawan has done a story on this in People's Dispatch. When you talk to activists over there, when you talk to members of what are called the neighborhood resistance committees over there, the overwhelming information you get is that the withdrawal of the emergency was a complete farce. It was basically a step taken just to sort of placate the international community, which has been pushing for negotiations. And even as the emergency was withdrawn, the repression continued unabated. On around the same time, I think May 29th, 30th, 31st, there were again massive protests as well as the continued repression of many of these protests. And some of the numbers that come out of this are quite staggering in terms of what is the impact on injuries, the impact of firing, etc., etc. So it's a mere formality because the regime now feels kind of fair. It also seems to indicate that the regime feels confident enough that it can continue this without continue the repression without any major fear of censure. So in some senses, they're also sort of trying to provide a smokescreen in that way by saying that we've withdrawn the emergency, everything is back to normal. Now the international community is trying to sort of do this negotiation process, but the fact remains that there are very, very few in the political spectrum in Sudan who are actually interested in participating in these negotiations along with the military, because the overwhelming spirit on the ground is for a full restoration of democracy. That is what the resistance committees want, that is what the trade unions want, that is what the Sudanese Communist Party, which has been very active in it, wants. So except for very few minor parties and the leadership of the biggest party, that's the National Ummah Party. So except for them, everyone else is against this demand, and even the biggest party, that is the NUP, its rank and file is very much on the side of the protesters. They do not want these kind of negotiations with the military junta, because the military junta is interested in these negotiations only to maintain its own power and to use a small veneer of civilian rule to legitimize its own control over Sudan. So what they would ideally want is some kind of a figurehead technocratic prime minister and cabinet who actually have no powers. But for the international world, for the international community's consumption, there is a civilian government. And it's important to note that in Sudan, the military itself controls a large part of the economy, and that there's going to be no change in that. So what the protesters have sought since 2018-19 is for a systemic change which actually accommodates all these issues. For instance, we talked about the rapid support forces, which played a key role in the 2019 massacre. To this day, they continue to be active. In fact, in the recent violence in Darfur, they played a very integral role. It is said that they were responsible for a lot of the killings, the kind of weaponry, the kind of transport, logistics that was involved clearly indicated the involvement of the RSF and its leader, General Hamid Dagalo, known as Hemeti. The fact that this person, despite so many accusations against him, is still today the second most powerful person in Sudan indicates that systemically, structurally, there's really been not too much of a change from Omar al-Bashir's time. And this is what the protest movements, people on the streets want to change. This is what they're against. And this is why they're unhappy with this idea of negotiations. So although the UN, the international community, they've been sort of saying that everyone will sit and talk, the point is, what do you talk about? The protesters are saying that we want to talk about something else, which is different from what the military wants to talk about.
Right.
We want to talk about systemic and structural solutions to the problems which the military has caused over decades, and which has never really been addressed even during the time of the last civilian government. So that's the situation right now.
All right. Prashant, thanks for that update. We'll be back with you in just another minute. The war in Ukraine has been on for 100 days, a milestone crossed as Russia slowly takes control over Ukraine's eastern regions, and military support for Ukraine from NATO and EU countries grows. The United States, Germany, and other Western countries have imposed hefty trade sanctions on Russia. Thousands have died and millions have been forced to become refugees. There has been a buildup of pro-war sentiments against Russia in the last 3 months in Europe and in the United States. We'll go back to Prashant and talk about the current situation. Prashant, has the US-led sanctions on Russia worked? Have they worked as sanctions are supposedly meant to work?
Right, well, that's an important question as to how sanctions are supposedly meant to work, because the actual way in which they work is basically punish people wherever they're imposed, Venezuela, Iran. We've seen that everywhere.
Right.
But in this specific context, it largely looks like the sanctions have kind of failed, in the sense that, let's see why we're saying this, because the idea of the United States and the West was that they would apply these heavy lightning bolt of sanctions which would just completely destabilize Russia. People would be crushed. There would be a mass anger against Putin. People would rise and Putin would somehow disappear. That
Right.
seems to have been the calculation, because
Right.
if you look at some of the claims that the US was making, leaked media reports, for instance, saying that even before December, the war began in February, even before December, we were coordinating about sanctions, everyone was on the same page, etc., etc. They say all these things. But the fact is that in terms of actual economic impact, there's not been much. Now, it's a different question as to whether there will be a medium-term or a long-term impact. That's a completely different question. But except for the flashy, slogans and the kind of photo ops and the defiant declarations by people in Europe and the US, it doesn't, in terms of actual economic impact, it's not really worked out. Now, let's see why. First of all, the fact is that for every round of sanctions the EU and the US have imposed, and a lot of it has to do with oil prices. Oil, for instance. Oil prices have actually soared. So, and with oil prices soaring, Russia is in a position to actually sell its oil to other countries, and there are other countries willing to buy it. India, for instance, has bought a huge amount of oil compared to its previous purchases from Russia. There's, of course, sales to China, for instance, have increased. And even if some of these sales are happening in terms of discount, the fact that Russia continues to make a considerable amount of money out of selling oil, which is natural, because the fact is that prices have increased due to the announcement of sanctions, the uncertainty, all that together. Some of the U.S. allies, for so-called allies in terms of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, some of the OPEC countries, they have not really been willing to come to the aid of the U.S. by massively increasing production.
Right.
So what we have actually seen is that despite all these so-called sanctions, Russia has a very healthy current account balance. I think it's much more than last year. So in some senses, this has not really had much of an impact. And what we're also seeing is that the European Union and the US also realize that any substantial attack on Russian energy supplies is going to hurt them more, because we are in a situation where inflation is at an all-time high. It was 9% in the United Kingdom recently. That's 30-year high, and food prices are soaring at various places. We do know that a combination of energy and food prices being increasing is probably going to cause massive popular unrest. Many of these governments sort of already in Europe lacking a huge amount of popular legitimacy, and the last thing they want is massive protests as winter starts. As winter escalates in Europe, if these governments don't want to see people taking to the streets and saying, give us our basic necessities after pursuing decades of austerity policies,
right.
All these governments are also incapable of delivering a lot of these. So basically, the deeds of decades past and the deeds of the past few months have come back to haunt Europe and the United States as well. Huge inflation, so many supply side problems. So all this together, it doesn't really look like the sanctions have begun to hurt Russia. Like I said, 6 months down the line, 8 months down the line, some of this might begin to have an impact. But for now, it's really not having the impact that these countries had predicted.
All right. So, Prashant, there was also Russia's goals, demilitarization and denazification. Where do you think it is on these two goals of the war on Ukraine?
Right. So, Pragya, there's two aspects here. One is that while these were stated goals, it's not really very, very clear what the exact Russian war aims were, because in its own way, these two slogans are also kind of slightly vague in that sense. Demilitarization, if it means the substantial degradation of Ukraine's military forces, that has definitely happened. Now, the United States itself has pumped in billions of dollars. I think purely in terms of military aid, the overall allotment for the Ukraine war per se has been around 20 million, if not more. Now, that itself, that's just US, and other countries, of course, are also pumping in various amounts of weapons. But all this together is still unlikely to be enough to actually, mount any major response to the Russian offensive. And we see that the Russian strategy has now gone into a relatively slow, it doesn't make too much news, but it is a strategy of constant pounding, of constant bombing of Ukrainian military and strategic assets, and that has really begun to take its toll. We do see that their forces are suffering massive reductions. Even the US media has been sort of forced to acknowledge the fact, because we see the New York Times. Speaking of which, the Guardian recently had carried an opinion piece which openly said that Russia is winning the economic war. A couple of weeks ago, we had a New York Times writing, and in some senses almost admitting that it's not possible for Ukraine to win this war, despite all these statements, because even they're forced to acknowledge it after cheerleading for so long, that they're forced to acknowledge the fact that however much these kind of supplies and weapons come in, there has to be a existing, say, logistical and infrastructural and human resource base for an army to function. And those links are what are being destroyed slowly. So just putting in equipment does not necessarily solve the problem. There is a huge loss of morale as far as many Ukrainian soldiers are concerned. President Zelensky himself giving the estimate of 60 to 100 soldiers dying per day. Now, it could be even some other estimates say it could be close to 200 Ukrainian soldiers. So with this kind of losses, which are actually irreplaceable, because you can't just give people guns and expect them to sort of go to the front, which they're doing.
Right.
But that's really not effective. So in that sense, what we see basically is that Russia is pretty much likely to consolidate its hold on the eastern region of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, definitely what is known as the Donbass region. From now, the real question is, from there, where do they go? Do they sort of try to create a corridor across these regions through Crimea to the city of Odessa? Do they maybe try Kharkiv once again? All these are open questions, and the Russians are being very cautious about announcing these objectives. So
Right.
the Russian way of doing military operations seems very, very different. So still a bit difficult to say, but and denazification, of course, we saw that the Azov battalion has been, pretty much completely destroyed. Mariupol captured, of course, that was their base. Azov battalion now saying that they're going to remove their neo-Nazi insignia to
Right.
sort of make them more palatable. Maybe, I don't know why, but that's also progressed. So technically yes, but these are very vague war aims. So what the Russians have calculated as their final end point is really very unclear now.
Is there an end to this war in Ukraine?
Very, very difficult to say. Negotiations are not really happening. So the US, what the West hopes is that Russia will be so weakened that they are going to come to a negotiating table. That does not really seem to be what is happening on the battlefield, and there's increasing recognition of the fact. So, I mean, unless there is some kind of major step from one of the parties concerned, very difficult to see a close end in the short term.
All right, Prashant, thanks a lot for that update. In a rare U-turn, UEFA, the body that runs football in Europe and was responsible for organizing the Champions League final held in Paris last week, has sincerely apologized to fans for the distressing situation they had to face while trying to get into the stadium for the game. UEFA had initially, in a typical knee-jerk reaction, blamed fans for the chaos that delayed the start of the final by more than half an hour. Fans were tear-gassed and pepper-sprayed by the French police at separate points, and they had to go through layers of harassment while making their way to the Stade de France for the final between English club Liverpool and Spain's Real Madrid. We'll talk to Siddhant Ane for more about this. Siddhant, what is the UEFA now saying?
Well, I have the statement from UEFA with me. I can read out a short bit. Essentially, they're saying that UEFA, I quote now, UEFA wishes to sincerely apologize to all spectators who had to either experience or witness what it's calling frightening and distressing events in the build-up to this Champions League final. You remember we talked about
Yes.
this on the show the day after that final took place. And at that point, the authorities were squarely putting all of the blame for whatever happened, whether it's the delay or the action that the French police had to take against these fans. All of the blame for it was being put squarely on fans of both Real Madrid and Liverpool who were in Paris for this final. I guess now, after events have been sort of reconstructed, people have gone through eyewitness accounts, CCTV footage, etc., etc. It's been determined sort of, I guess, subjectively, that the fans were not the only ones at fault. Perhaps organizers could have done better.
Okay.
So what UEFA is now doing, apart from this apology, is they've also commissioned an independent review led by one Dr. Tiago Brandao Rodrigues, who's a Portuguese person who will create or look at all of these events, both in the stadium as well as surrounding areas, flows of spectators as they were coming to the ground from various parts of Paris, how they entered through various access points, and where the trouble exactly took place. The review, again from this sort of this statement, will look at all relevant operational plans related to security, mobility, ticketing, as well as other things at the discretion of the chairman of the review committee. So one major issue that was also pointed out was that a lot of people had come to the ground with fake tickets.
Right.
Now, these tickets look and feel exactly like the real thing, but because of QR codes and other security mechanisms that are now available through technology, when you present that ticket at the turnstile, the machine rejects it.
All right.
So when it's rejected, naturally, then there's a discussion because these fans have paid hundreds, sometimes thousands of euros to buy these tickets. You know, sometimes they come in groups, entire families are there together. So it leads to some kind of choking of these access points. So fake ticketing is a big problem. I remember being at one Champions League final where people were crying and like all kinds of things are happening because it's for football fans. It's for many, it's a once in a lifetime sort of situation where your club is in the final and you've managed to get a ticket and you've traveled from wherever you've traveled and all of that stuff. So UEFA finally admitting that fans who are actually the people that pay for this game to become this big thing that it has become on a global stage should not have to face this kind of harassment.
Right.
It's a good step.
Right. So, Siddhant, it's also become a sort of diplomatic back and forth between England and France. Can you talk about what's really going on there?
Yeah, so again, as we were talking briefly last time, for example, in 2016, France hosted the European Championships. And in Marseille, ahead of the game between England and Russia, there were some really, really ugly scenes in the city with fans of both sides sort of running riot through the city, fueled by alcohol and all of that. A lot of damage was done to local-owned businesses and just general overall violence and ugliness. So this is something that has somehow become an association with English football fans specifically. The kind of reaction that England fans receive wherever in the world they travel, and I've been to several tournaments now, whether it's South America or in Europe or elsewhere, they carry with them this baggage or this label of hooliganism. It's very much also, really speaking, very much a part of fan culture, football fan culture in the United Kingdom. So perhaps building on that, the French Interior Minister put a lot of the blame for, naturally he's defending his own police forces, right? I've also seen how the French police, particularly French riot police, how they react when any small incident takes place. There is no quarter given, and it's a lot of high-handedness, extreme violence with which they deal with mostly unarmed spectators, fans, or even if it's mildly unruly elements, they're dealt with extreme force. So the French Interior Minister defending his own forces, as well as saying that these drunk Englishmen, 6,500, 7,000 of them who've travelled from England supporting Liverpool, come to Paris, spend the day drinking, and so it's all their fault.
Okay.
The English have reacted saying, they've reached out to those fans who travelled to France, asked them for feedback to reconstruct and to create their own narrative around what happened and who was to blame, etc., etc.
Right.
So this is something that will continue, and I think both governments will, at some point, the French president has also come into the picture saying, let's figure out what happened and let's reimburse fans who were not able to enter the stadium, etc., etc. But without really taking any responsibility for what happened in his capital city.
All right. Thanks, Siddhant, for coming with this
Anytime.
information to us. And that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And for more updates and analysis from around the world, visit peoplesdispatch.org.